Some secrets are signed in daylight with trumpets and crowds and cameras. This one was signed in the dark, by candlelight, in a room the servants had been ordered to forget. An old king, a shaking hand, and a single sheet of paper that would change who truly held the power of a kingdom. Nobody outside those four walls knew. Not the court. Not the queen. Not the heir who believed the throne was already his in all but name. By the time the sun rose over Aldermere, one woman would carry the weight of a crown she never asked for, and the whole palace would wake to a world that had quietly shifted beneath their feet while they slept. This is the story of the night the king chose the one person everyone had overlooked, and why he trusted her above them all. The rain came down on Aldermere like it meant to drown the whole kingdom. It had started at dusk, soft at first, and then heavier until the great windows of the palace shivered under it and the gutters roared like small rivers. Lightning cracked far out over the hills, throwing white light across the old stone walls for half a second before the dark swallowed everything again. In the servants' quarters, the younger maids pulled their blankets tighter and told each other it was only a storm. But the older ones, the ones who had served 3 kings, felt something in the air that they could not name. They had learned over long years that some nights carried more than weather. High in the eastern wing, in a study that most of the palace had forgotten existed, King Alaric III sat alone by a dying fire. He was 74 years old, and the last year had taken more from him than the 10 before it. His hands, once steady enough to hold a sword through a 2-hour ceremony without a tremble, now shook when he lifted a cup of tea. His doctors spoke to him in careful, gentle voices, the kind of voices people use when they are trying not to say a hard thing out loud. He had stopped asking them how much time he had. He had started asking himself instead what he would leave behind, and whether it would survive him. That was the question that kept him awake on nights like this one. The kingdom he loved was not the kingdom his father had handed him. The world outside the palace gates had grown restless and loud. People no longer bowed simply because a man wore a crown. They asked what the crown was for. They asked who paid for it and why, and what good it did them when their own lives felt so uncertain. Alaric did not blame them. In his own quiet way, he agreed with more of it than he ever admitted. But a monarchy that could not answer those questions was a monarchy that would not last, and he had spent the final years of his reign trying to keep the whole fragile thing from cracking apart in his hands. The trouble was that he could not do it alone anymore, and there were fewer people around him to lean on than the public ever guessed. From the outside, the royal family of Aldermere looked large and strong. There were portraits in every hall, names in every history book, a whole gallery of faces smiling out at the nation. But inside the palace, behind the polished doors, the truth was thinner and colder. The people who actually did the work, who stood in the rain at ceremonies, who visited the hospitals and the schools and the flooded villages, who shook 10,000 hands a year, and remembered the names of people who would never remember theirs, that circle had shrunk to almost nothing. His son and heir, Crown Prince Cedric, had all but vanished from public life. It was not scandal that had taken him, but grief. His wife had fallen gravely ill the previous winter, and Cedric had pulled back from everything to sit at her side. Alaric could not fault him for it. He had loved his own wife the same way. Once, but a future king who could not be seen was a future king the people did not know, and a king they did not know was a king they would not trust. His younger nephew, once a favorite of the crowds, had been quietly removed from all royal duties 2 years earlier after a series of choices that the palace still refused to speak about in full. His name was no longer printed in the official lists. The staff had learned not to mention him. And so, when Alaric counted the people he could truly rely on, the ones who would put duty above comfort and the kingdom above themselves, he kept arriving at the same name. Not the loudest name, not the most glamorous, but the steadiest. His sister, Princess Rowena of Aldermere, was 2 years younger than the king, and she had spent her entire life being underestimated. She was not the kind of royal who made headlines. She did not wear dazzling gowns to grand balls, or give long speeches, or court the cameras. She wore sensible coats and flat shoes and a wristwatch her mother had given her 40 years ago. She woke before dawn. She read every letter that crossed her desk. In a single year, she had carried out more public engagements than any other member of the family, most of them small, most of them unglamorous, none of them designed to make her look important. She opened homeless shelters in towns no reporter bothered to visit. She sat with old soldiers who had no one left to talk to. She learned the names of the nurses in the hospitals she toured, and the next year she remembered them. The people who worked beside her called her, quietly and with deep affection, the Iron Rose. She had the softness of a flower and the spine of a blade, and she had never once, in 50 years of service, complained about the weight of it. She had never wanted power. That, Alaric had come to understand, was exactly why she deserved it. He rang the small bell on his desk, an old habit, and then remembered he had sent the staff away hours ago. He had wanted no witnesses tonight. He rose slowly, one hand pressed to the arm of his chair, and shuffled to the door himself. In the corridor stood the one man he still trusted with everything. Sir Edmund Vale, his private secretary of 30 years, gray-haired now, straight-backed still, holding a lantern against the storm-darkened halls. "She's here," Edmund said quietly. "I brought her up the old stair as you asked. No one saw." "Good," Alaric said. His voice was thinner than it used to be. "Send her in. And Edmund, after tonight, you and I will speak of what comes next. There is a great deal to arrange and not as much time as I would like." Edmund's face did not change, but something in his eyes softened, the way a loyal man's eyes do when he understands more than he is being told. "Yes, your Majesty," he said, and went to fetch her. Rowena came in, still shaking rainwater from her coat. She had been at a hospice 3 counties away when the message reached her, sitting with a dying woman who had asked in her last clear hours to hold the hand of someone kind. Rowena had stayed until the woman slept, and only then had she read the note. It had been short. "Come tonight. Come quietly. Tell no one." It was signed with a single letter A, and she had known her brother's hand at a glance. She had driven through the storm herself, with one trusted driver and no ceremony, and she had come up the servants' stair like a thief in her own family's house. Now she stood in the doorway of the forgotten study and looked at the man her brother had become, and her heart clenched. "Alaric," she said softly, "not your Majesty, not here, not tonight. You look tired." "I look old," he corrected and almost smiled. "There is a difference, and I have earned the second one. Sit with me, Ro. There is something I have to tell you and something I have to ask, and I would rather do both while I still have the strength for the telling." She crossed the room and sat, and she took his hand between hers the way she had taken so many hands in so many quiet rooms, and she felt at once how thin his fingers had grown. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She had sat beside enough dying people to know that the kindest thing you could give them was calm. "Tell me," she said. And so he told her. He told her what the doctors had said and what they had not said, and how he had read the truth in the spaces between their words. He told her that he did not expect to see the next spring, and that even the months before it would grow harder, that there would be days, perhaps long stretches of days, when he simply could not rule. He could not sign what needed signing. He could not stand where a king had to stand. He could not decide the 1,000 small things that held a kingdom steady, and a kingdom that stood still for too long began, very quietly, to fall. "The country cannot see me like this," he said. "A king who cannot lift his own pen is a king the vultures circle, and they are circling, Ro. You know they are. There are men in this court who have already begun to divide up my kingdom in their heads, planning which of them will whisper into Cedric's ear when he is crowned, which of them will hold the real power while he grieves. I have watched them smile at me and count my days." His jaw tightened. "I will not leave the throne to be picked apart by men who never earned the right to touch it." "Cedric," she began. "Cedric will be king," Alaric said firmly. "That does not change. He is my son and he is the heir and the crown is his by right and by law. But he is not ready, Ro, not yet. He is broken with worry for his wife, and a broken man cannot hold a whole kingdom together while the ground shifts under him. He needs time. He needs someone to hold the door open until he is strong enough to walk through it himself. His grip tightened on her hand. He needs a shield, and so does the kingdom. Someone the people already trust. Someone the vultures cannot buy, cannot frighten, cannot flatter. Someone who has spent her whole life proving, quietly, every single day, that duty means more to her than she means to herself. The room was very still. Outside, the rain kept falling. Rowena understood, suddenly and completely, why she had been called through the storm. "No," she said. "Alaric, no, there are others, there must be others." "There is no one else," he said, and the plain truth of it sat between them like a stone. "I have counted, Ro. I have counted 100 times in the dark when I could not sleep. There is no one else I would trust with this. There is no one else the people would accept. There is only you." "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That is the whole reason. The ones who want it are exactly the ones who must never have it. I learned that from our father and he learned it from his. Power should only ever be handed to the hands that do not reach for it." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him something. "I am not asking you to be queen. You will never wear the crown and you have never wanted to. I am asking you to guard it. To stand in the gap for as long as I cannot, and for as long as Cedric needs, and then to step back into the shadows the moment he is ready, and never once ask for anything in return. It is the hardest thing I have ever asked of anyone, and you are the only person alive I would trust to do it, and then let it go." On the desk between them lay a single sheet of heavy paper, already written in the careful hand of the king's own clerk, waiting only for what it needed to make it real. It named Princess Rowena as Regent Protector of the realm, granting her the authority to act in the king's name, to sign in his stead, to hold and steady the machinery of the kingdom whenever the king himself could not. It was not a crown. It was not a throne. It was something quieter and, in that moment, something heavier. It was the whole weight of a country, placed without warning onto the shoulders of a woman who had spent her life carrying other people's burdens and never once her own. Rowena stared at it for a long time. She thought of the hospice and the dying woman's hand in hers only hours before. She thought of all the small rooms and forgotten towns and quiet duties of 50 years, and she understood that they had, without her ever intending it, been a kind of preparation for exactly this. She had never chased the crown, but she had spent a lifetime becoming, without meaning to, the one person strong enough to be trusted near it. "If I do this," she said slowly, "they will hate me for it, the court, the ones you call vultures. They will say I stole it. They will say I whispered in your ear while you were weak. They will paint me as the ambitious sister who reached for power at her brother's deathbed." Her voice did not shake, but her eyes were bright. "You know they will say that." "I know," Alaric said quietly. "That is the cruelty of it. I am asking you to take the blows so that the kingdom does not, and to take them without ever being able to defend yourself, because to defend yourself would be to admit how sick I truly am, and that we cannot let them know. You will be hated by the very people you are protecting, and you will have to bear it in silence." He looked at her, and for a moment he was not a king at all, only an old man asking his little sister for the last great favor of his life. "I would not ask it of anyone else. I cannot. There is no one else with a spine strong enough to stand in the fire and a heart clean enough to walk out of it without wanting to keep the crown for herself." The fire had burned down to embers. The candle guttered and steadied. Somewhere far below, a clock struck midnight, its slow chimes rolling up through the sleeping palace. Rowena reached out and picked up the pen. She did not do it quickly. She held it for a long moment, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of everything behind it. She thought of her husband, Lord Tristan, asleep at home and unaware, who had spent 40 years supporting her from the quiet edge of every room, and would now be dragged into a storm he never chose. She thought of the people in the towns who trusted her, and of how many of them would soon believe the worst. She thought of Cedric, grieving in the dark, who would one day understand, she hoped, that this was done to protect him and not to steal from him. And she thought of her brother, who had loved this kingdom every day of his life, and was now spending the last of his strength trying to keep it whole for people who would never know what it had cost him. "For you," she said softly, "and for them, not for me, never for me." "Never for you," he agreed, his voice breaking on the words. "That is exactly why it has to be you." She signed. The pen moved across the paper in the small circle of candlelight, and in the space of a few seconds a kingdom quietly changed shape. There were no trumpets. There were no crowds. There was only an old king and his sister, and a witness by the door and the rain against the glass. Sir Edmund Vale stepped forward from the shadows where he had waited, and he too signed his name beneath hers, the required witness making it lawful and real. His hand, unlike the king's, did not shake, but when he set the pen down, he found he could not quite lift his eyes, because he had served this family for 30 years and he understood, better than anyone, what he had just watched a good woman agree to carry. "It is done," Alaric breathed. He sank back into his chair as though the signing had drained the last of him. "It is done, and it is right, and God forgive me for the burden I have laid on you." He reached for her hand again. "You must tell no one until I say, not Tristan, not Cedric, no one. When the moment comes, it must come cleanly on our terms before the vultures can twist it into their own story. Until then, this room and this hour never happened. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. But even as she said it, neither of them heard the soft sound in the corridor beyond, the faint creak of a floorboard that should have been empty, the quiet withdrawal of someone who had come to the king's study at midnight for reasons of her own, and had stopped just short of the door when she heard voices within. Someone had been standing in the dark hallway. Someone had heard enough. And as Rowena folded the signed paper and slipped it into her coat, and as the storm outside began at last to soften into a thin gray drizzle, the first pale light of dawn was already creeping toward the horizon, carrying with it a morning in which the palace would wake, and the court would gather, and a secret sign by candlelight would begin, slowly and unstoppably, to make its way out into the light. The woman in the corridor had a name, and the name was Lady Seraphine Marne. She was 38, sharp as cut glass, and she had spent the better part of a decade making herself useful to powerful men. She had come to the king's study at midnight carrying a folder of papers she hoped he would sign in a tired and unguarded moment, small favors for the men she served, the kind of favors that looked like nothing on their own but added up, over years, into real power. She had not expected to find the door already occupied. She had not expected voices. And she certainly had not expected to hear the one thing that could be worth more than every favor in her folder combined. The king was dying, faster than anyone knew, and he had just handed the running of the kingdom to his sister in secret. Seraphine had stood frozen against the cold stone wall, barely breathing, and she had listened to almost all of it. By the time she slipped away down the servant's stair, her mind was already racing 3 moves ahead. She served men who would pay a great deal to know what she now knew. The only question was how to use it, and when. She did not go to them that night. That was the first clever thing she did. A rumor spilled too early was a coin spent too cheaply. She went to her rooms, and she sat awake until dawn, and she thought. 2 floors above her, Princess Rowena did not sleep either. She had left her brother slumped and gray in his chair, with Sir Edmund watching over him, and she had driven home through the last of the storm with the signed paper pressed against her heart like a stone she could not put down. When she reached her own house before dawn, her husband was waiting up for her, a lamp burning low in the window. Lord Tristan had been married to her for 40 years, and he knew the difference between his wife tired and his wife troubled the way a sailor knows the difference between weather. "What is it?" he asked, before she had even taken off her wet coat. "Ro, what's happened?" She had promised to tell no one. She had meant to keep that promise. But she looked at the man who had stood at the quiet edge of every room of her life, asking for nothing, and she found she could not carry this entirely alone. "I cannot tell you," she said. Not yet. Alaric has asked me to hold something and to hold it in silence, and it is the heaviest thing anyone has ever asked of me. I need you to trust me without knowing why. Can you do that?" Tristan looked at her for a long moment. Then he took her cold hands in his warm ones and pressed them, and he said the thing he had spent 40 years proving he meant. "I have never once needed to know why," he said. "I only ever needed to know it was you. Whatever it is, you won't carry it alone. I'll be exactly where I've always been, right beside you, saying nothing and watching your back." For the first time that night, Rowena's composure cracked, just slightly, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and let herself be held for the length of 3 slow breaths. Then she straightened, because she had learned long ago that the ones who lean the longest are the ones who forget how to stand. The palace woke, as it always did, to the sound of bells. The court gathered in the long gallery for the morning audience, though everyone present could feel that something in the air had changed, and no one could say what. The king did not appear. That in itself was not unheard of. He had missed mornings before in the last hard year, but there was a new quality to his absence today, a heaviness, as if the empty chair at the head of the gallery had grown somehow larger. Courtiers murmured behind their hands. Sir Edmund Vale moved among them with his usual grave calm, saying only that His Majesty was resting and would receive no one until further notice. It was into this uncertain quiet that the first whisper fell. It did not come from Seraphine directly. That was the second clever thing she did. She let it fall through 3 careful mouths before it reached the men who mattered, so that by the time it arrived it had the shape of a rumor that belonged to no one and therefore could not be traced back to her. "The king is worse than they are telling us. The king has signed something in secret. The king has passed real power not to the heir but to the sister." The men who mattered were led by the Earl of Corvin, and the Earl of Corvin was precisely the kind of man King Alaric had meant when he spoke of vultures. Corvin was old wealth and older ambition. For years he had positioned himself close to Crown Prince Cedric, offering counsel that always somehow served Corvin's interests first. He had counted the king's failing health as a clock counting down to his own rise, for a grieving, unready Cedric would be a king who leaned, and Corvin intended to be the thing he leaned upon. He had planned it all carefully, and now into those careful plans fell 3 words that turned his stomach to ice. "The sister has it." He understood at once what it meant. Not a crown, he was not a fool, he knew Cedric would still be king. But a regent protector held the real machinery in the meantime. A regent protector signed the papers, held the seals, decided the 1,000 small things. And a regent protector who was Princess Rowena, honest, unbuyable, beloved of exactly the ordinary people Corvin despised, was a wall he could not climb and could not bribe and could not frighten. She would hold the door shut against him for as long as the king needed, and by the time it opened, Cedric might be steady enough to stand without him. She had to be broken before the appointment became public. That was the only way. Corvin understood that a secret, once brought into the light on his terms, could be poisoned before it ever took root. And so, that very afternoon, he began to build his story. It was a simple story, and an ugly one, and it had the terrible advantage of being almost impossible to disprove. The ambitious sister, he would whisper, had crept to her brother's side while he was weak and frightened and half out of his mind with illness, and she had pressed a pen into his shaking hand and taken the kingdom for herself. She had always resented the throne going to the brother instead of her. She had waited 50 years, wearing her sensible coats and her false humility, and now, at the last, she had struck. The iron rose, he would say, had shown her thorns at last. None of it was true, all of it was believable, that was the poison of it. By evening, the whisper had spread beyond the palace walls and into the wider world, and here Corvin found allies he had not even needed to pay, for there is nothing the loud and restless part of a nation loves so much as a story about a powerful family betraying itself. Within a day, the questions were everywhere. Had the king been in his right mind? Had the sister taken advantage? Why the secrecy if there was nothing to hide? The very quietness that Alaric had chosen to protect the kingdom was now being turned into evidence of a crime. Rowena watched it happen and could say nothing. That was the cruelty her brother had warned her of, arriving exactly as he had promised. To defend herself, she would have to explain, to tell the world how sick the king truly was, how thin the family had grown, how close the whole structure stood to collapse. And to say any of that would be to hand Corvin and his kind the very panic they were hoping to create. Her silence was the shield. Her silence was the whole point. And so she absorbed every blow without answering, and she went on with her duties as if nothing had changed, and the cost of it showed only in the new lines around her eyes. She visited a flooded village 3 days after the signing, standing in the same rain that had never really stopped, and a man in the small crowd shouted at her that she should be ashamed, that she had robbed her own brother, that she was a thief in a nice coat. The crowd around him shifted uncomfortably. Rowena did not flinch. She walked directly to the man, and she looked at him with a steadiness that made him fall silent despite himself, and she said, quietly, so only those nearest could hear, "You have every right to be angry when you don't trust the people above you. I would only ask you to wait and watch what I do, and not what you are told I did. Judge me by that. That is all I have ever asked of anyone." Then she turned and went on shaking hands and remembering names in the rain until the light failed. The man did not shout again, but he did not apologize either, and she did not expect him to. She had long ago stopped needing to be thanked for doing right. Meanwhile, in the palace, the one person who could have ended it all with a single word lay in a curtained room, too weak to speak it. King Alaric had collapsed the morning after the signing. The strain of that final effort, the storm, the confession, the burden he had laid down, had taken the last reserve of strength he had been hoarding. He drifted now between sleep and waking, and in his clear hours he understood with terrible frustration that events were moving exactly as he had feared, and faster than he had planned. The appointment was meant to be revealed cleanly, on his terms, with his own voice behind it. Instead, it was being dragged into the light in pieces, twisted, before he could stand up and say, "I chose this. I chose her. She did not take it, I gave it with my whole heart because she is the best of us." He could not say it. He could barely lift his head. But Sir Edmund Vale could, and it was here that 30 years of quiet loyalty became something more than a job. Edmund had watched the whispers spread with a cold and growing anger. He knew the truth of that night. He had signed his own name beneath the princess's, and he knew who benefited from the lie, and he had spent 3 decades learning exactly how the machinery of the court could be turned. He went to the king one evening, in a clear hour, and he knelt by the bed and asked a single question. "Your Majesty, you told her to say nothing until the moment was right. You said it must come cleanly on our terms." He paused. "The moment is here, sir. It has come whether we willed it or not. If we wait any longer for it to be clean, there will be nothing left to save. I need your leave to act, not to let it out in pieces, but to bring the whole truth into the light at once before they finish poisoning it. Will you give me that leave?" For a long moment the king said nothing, and Edmund feared he had drifted again. Then Alaric's hand moved slowly and found Edmund's, and gripped it with the last of his strength. "Do it," the king breathed. "Tell them everything. Tell them I was dying and I knew it. Tell them I chose her because she never wanted it. Tell them," his voice caught, "tell them a king's last act was to trust the one person who would never betray that trust. Let them hate me if they must, but do not let them hate her for the gift I gave her. That is the one thing I cannot bear to leave behind." "They will not hate her, sir," Edmund said. "When they know the truth, they will love her more than they ever loved any crown. I have seen it in her for 30 years. So will they." He rose, and he bowed to his dying king, and he went out to do the hardest and most important thing he had ever done. What Edmund arranged was not a rumor and not a leak. It was the truth, told plainly all at once, and told by the man best placed to be believed. He gathered the household, the honest members of the court, the ones Corvin had not touched. He produced the signed and witnessed decree, and his own name beneath the princess's, and the king's own hand above them both. He explained the king's illness, not in a whisper but openly, gravely, with the dignity the moment deserved. He explained that the appointment was not a theft but a trust, not the sister reaching for power but the king placing it, deliberately, into the only hands he believed clean enough to hold it, and then let it go. And then he did the thing that broke Corvin's story entirely. He told them what the appointment was for, not to replace Cedric, but to protect him, to hold the door open while the heir grieved, so that, when Cedric was ready, the kingdom would still be whole enough to hand to him. Rowena's own instruction, written into the decree in her own request, was that she would step back the very day the crown prince felt able to stand, and ask for nothing, keep nothing, and vanish once more into the quiet service she had always chosen. A woman who plots to seize a kingdom does not write, into her own appointment, the terms of her own disappearance. That single detail did what 100 defenses could not. It could not be argued with. It could not be twisted. It was simply, plainly, the opposite of everything Corvin had whispered. And as it spread as fast as the lie had spread, and further because the truth had the king's own dying voice behind it, the story turned. The people who had shouted began to fall quiet. The man in the flooded village, hearing it, sat down heavily and put his face in his hands, ashamed. The iron rose had not shown her thorns. She had spent 3 days being cut by them, in silence, to protect a brother and a nephew and a kingdom that had, for those 3 days, believed the worst of her. The Earl of Corvin understood, the moment the truth landed, that he had lost. A man who has built his whole position on a lie has nowhere to stand when the lie collapses. Within a week he had withdrawn from court, citing his health, and the men who had gathered around him melted quietly away, as such men always do, to look for the next rising sun. As for Lady Seraphine Marne, she was clever enough to have covered her tracks, and no one ever proved that the first whisper had come from her lips. But Sir Edmund Vale, who forgot nothing and forgave slowly, made certain that she was never again in a room where anything mattered. It was the quietest kind of punishment, and for a woman like Seraphine, it was the cruelest, to be made forever unimportant. King Alaric lived 11 more days. They were gentle days in the end. The frenzy had passed, and the truth had settled, and he was able to spend his last strength not on defending his final choice, but on simply saying goodbye. Cedric came, at last, out of the shadow of his own grief. His wife had begun, slowly, to recover, and with her recovery came the first return of his strength. He sat with his father, and his father told him everything, and Cedric wept, not with resentment but with a kind of awe, understanding for the first time the size of the gift that had been arranged to protect him. "She held the door for you," Alaric told his son. "She never wanted to walk through it. She only ever wanted to hold it open so that you could. Do not waste what she guarded for you, and do not, as long as you live, let anyone tell you she took anything from you. She gave you time. It is the one thing I could not give you myself." Cedric went to his aunt that same evening. He did not know quite what to say to a woman who had let the whole nation believe her a thief rather than reveal how close he had come to inheriting a kingdom in ruins. In the end he said only, "Thank you," and it was enough, because Rowena had never needed more than that, and had usually received less. The king died in his sleep, in the deep quiet of a spring night, with his sister holding one hand and his son holding the other, and Sir Edmund Vale standing his last watch at the door. Rowena served as Regent Protector for a little under a year. She did exactly what she had promised and nothing more. She held the machinery steady. She signed what needed signing and decided what needed deciding, always in Cedric's name, never in her own. She made no grand changes, sought no honors, gave no speeches about herself. When ambitious men came to her, as they always come to whoever holds power, she sent them away empty. And the people, who had watched her weather 3 days of undeserved hatred without a word of complaint, came to trust her in that year more deeply than they had ever trusted anyone. Precisely, because she so plainly did not want what she held. And then, on a bright morning almost exactly a year after the storm, Crown Prince Cedric stood before the court, steady at last, and Rowena stepped forward and laid the seals of the regency into his hands and stepped back, and it was done. There were no trumpets for that either. She had asked for none. She simply became, once more, the quiet princess in the sensible coat, the one who woke before dawn and read every letter and remembered the names of nurses, and who could most often be found not at grand balls but in the small forgotten rooms where someone needed a kind hand to hold. Years later, a young clerk in the palace archives found the original decree while cataloging old papers and read it, and noticed the strange clause near the bottom, the one written at the princess's own request, laying out the terms of her own stepping down. He asked an older archivist why a person granted such power would insist, in writing, on the manner of giving it back. The old archivist, who had served long enough to remember the storm and the whispers and the truth that followed, was quiet for a moment. Because, he said at last, the ones who deserve to hold a kingdom are always the ones who cannot wait to set it down. She knew that better than anyone. It is the whole reason the king chose her. And it is the reason, long after the rest of us are forgotten, that they will still be telling her story, not the story of a woman who took a crown, but of the one who guarded it in the dark, asked for nothing, and quietly gave it back. Outside the archive window, over the old stone walls of Aldermere, the sun was shining. It had at long last stopped raining.